practice. Taking refuge can really bring a joy into the practice. The refuges are where stability and where security can be found. And that's why they're called refuges. Like this temple of our home that we're in. It's warm or cool. I hope it's secure and a still place that we've created for today, while the various, elements outside of breezes and sun and sounds today, and in other seasons there's rain and snow that are, outside. And on a physical level, we have created a safe refuge. On the internal level, the contemplative mind, the temple of wisdom and clear awareness, this is our refuge. In the same way, the heart takes refuge in awareness when it's attuned to the reality of the way things are, to the Dhamma. And then there's stillness and ease and security. So just as the weather can do whatever it likes to outside of our home, we can have this same kind of stability within our hearts. So when the heart abides in this triple gem of the three refuges, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, then the world of the senses and thoughts and feelings and the body can do whatever it needs to do. It can rage away and, let the rain fall, let the wind blow, rain if it wants to, because the heart is the greatest shelter. And that is why it's a refuge. It's reliable. And when we establish the refuges this way, acknowledging the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, we begin to trust more and more. The trusting heart can adapt to changing circumstances, to gain and loss and sickness and health, praise and criticism, happiness and unhappiness. That adaptation is built around the attitude of this is the way things are. Not unlike when it was so hot last week and I was so uncomfortable and wrapping wet scarves around my neck, and but the mind was finding the Dhamma to rest in, and eventually in mindful awareness of the way things are, the way things were, hot and sticky and awful, in my opinion. But, mindfulness can be present when the storms are raging around us in our hearts and minds. Because the heart and the mind doesn't really create a perception of something being wrong. Even when what is perceived, like the sense object, might be painful or unpleasant or unwanted, surprising, the heart-mind, or citta in the Pali word, heart and mind are together. They sort of mean the same thing, which is why sometimes it's nicer to just say the word citta, because it's not just mind, it's mind and heart. It doesn't add the feeling of wrongness to anything. It doesn't create the idea that it shouldn't be this way, or that something isn't fair, or why is life doing this to me? When the heart takes refuge in the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, we let go of this feeling of wrongness. Everything belongs. It's all happening. Still and bright days, belong, and wild and stormy days belong. Kindness and generosity belong. And even violence and selfishness also belong. It's the way things are right now. And so to be adaptable is to be open-hearted and to acknowledge that this is the way the world is. And on the basis of that acknowledgement, when the clear mind knows the way things are, when the Buddha, that awakening of us, sees the Dhamma, the way things are, what arises is the Sangha, this wholesome activity of ethical behavior. Ajahn Amaro says in one of his Dhamma articles that's called Everything is Uncertain, that's a great title, he says that the Buddha is the function, the Dhamma is the substance, and the Sangha is the manifestation. So the Buddha is the function, the awakening mind. The Dhamma is the substance. The awakening mind can see the way things are. And then the Sangha is the manifestation. It responds with wholesome action, unselfish action, action that does not cause ill will. And so this is sort of how the triple gem of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha works as a single unit. And so the first step in the practice, taking refuge in the Buddha, may be approached on various levels. We can choose the way that's most meaningful for our own temperament. We might, for instance, take refuge in the actual historical Buddha, the human being who attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago. Which doesn't mean that we're worshiping a man who became enlightened or setting him up as other than or higher than ourselves, but bowing and honoring the Buddha nature that already exists within us. Maybe you've heard me mention that when the Buddha encountered Mara, the extremely troubled mind state of Mara, while sitting under the Bodhi tree, it's said that he felt fear, the same painfully constricted throat and chest and belly, the same racing heart that we each experience when fear strikes our heart. And so in taking this first refuge, sometimes I say, I take refuge in a loving energy, or maybe even a beloved feeling that I'm nurturing. And I surrender into what I experience as the boundlessness of kindness and compassion. When I'm feeling fear, I surrender it to this loving and kind energy. But by this, I'm not trying to get rid of fear, but rather letting it go into a refuge that is vast enough to hold my fear with love. And in the most fundamental way, taking refuge in the Buddha means taking refuge in our own potential for liberation. Because in order to embark on the spiritual path, we need faith and confidence that our own heart and mind have the potential to awaken. The true power of the Buddha's story, the power that's kept it alive for all these centuries, rests in the fact that it demonstrates what is possible for us. We so easily believe limiting stories about ourselves and forget that our very nature, our Buddha nature, is aware and loving. When we take refuge in the Buddha, we're taking refuge in the same capacity of awareness that awakened Siddhartha under the Bodhi tree. We also can realize the blessing of freedom, and we too can become fearless. After taking refuge in this kind of loving energy, we can also turn our attention inward, saying that I take refuge in this awakening heart-mind, letting go of any notion that the Buddha nature is something beyond or outside of my awareness. We look towards the innate wakefulness of our own being, the openness of our hearts, fostering tenderness. Moments earlier, I might have been believing myself to be this rush of emotions and thoughts moving through my mind. But by intentionally taking refuge in awareness, that small identity dissolves. And within it, that stronghold of fear. So by directing our attention toward our deepest nature, by honoring the essence of our being, our own Buddha nature becomes to us a more living reality. We're taking refuge in the truth of who we are. By willingly meeting fear with his full attention, the Buddha discovered fearlessness, the open and clear awareness that recognizes the arising and passing of fear without contracting and without identifying with it. Taking refuge in the truth of his awakening can inspire us on our own path toward fearlessness. I think I'll read a couple of passages from the Dhammapada, which is a well-revered collection of the Buddha's sayings. And this one comes from a section called The Buddha. And it's, I think it's, if you ever go look for it, it's chapter 14. And it starts with verses 190 to 196. When someone goes for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, sees with right insight the Four Noble Truths, suffering, the arising of suffering, the overcoming of suffering, and the Eightfold Path leading to the ending of suffering, then this is the secure refuge. This is the supreme refuge. By going to such a refuge, one is released from all suffering. It's hard to find a noble person. Such a person is not born everywhere. When such a wise one is born, the family flourishes in happiness. Happy is the arising of the Buddhas. Happy is the teaching of the true Dhamma. Happy is the harmony of the Sangha. Happy is the ardent practice of those in harmony. The merit of appreciating those worthy of appreciation, be they Buddha or disciples who have transcended their obsessive thinking, passed beyond sorrow and grief, gone to peace, and who have nothing to fear, can never be calculated by any estimation. This is Gil Fronsdale's translation, who's one of my favorite teachers in California. There's lots and lots of translations of the Dhammapada. But so this idea of going to refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and the happiness that can come from the stability of the container, which takes us on into the precepts themselves, that sometimes they're considered like a three-legged, there's part of the three-legged stool. The Buddhist spiritual practice falls into these three general categories that are known in Pali as sila, samadhi, and panya. And they can be translated into English as virtue, meditation, and wisdom. It's sometimes called the threefold bliss. And so they function like these three legs of a tripod. That it's essential to cultivate all three: virtue, meditation, and wisdom. So wisdom and meditation don't develop without virtue, which is basically the ethical conduct, the safety of harmony within the Sangha. And so developing virtue and understanding the full depths of its possibility requires wisdom and meditation, so they all go together. So no English word really adequately translates sila. Sometimes in its historical origins, sila is said to come from the word bed. So we can see this as the bedrock or the foundation upon which the rest of our spiritual practice is built. Sooner or later, anyone who begins to develop some sensitivity through mindfulness practice will discover that without the foundation of virtue, the depths of sensitivity are harder to develop. And sila is usually translated as virtue or ethics, but we need to be careful not to confuse it with our Western ideas of virtue and ethics. A traditional foundation of Western ethics is things like the commandments, or they're often seen as they're handed down from God. They include values about right and wrong and good and evil and absolute rules that we have to live by. This approach to ethics leads very easily to guilt, an emotion that's pervasive in the West, but which is considered unnecessary and counterproductive in Buddhism. No thoughts of guilt. Because Buddhism understands that virtue and ethics pragmatically, based not on ideas of good and bad, but rather on the observation that some actions lead to suffering and some actions lead to happiness and freedom. A Buddhist asks, does this action lead to increased suffering or increased happiness for myself and for others? And this approach is more conducive to investigation than to guilt. So as guidelines for virtue and ethical behavior, the Buddha formulated these precepts for us to follow. For lay people, there are 5 guidelines. 1 is to abstain from killing. 1 is to abstain from stealing. 1 to abstain from sexual misconduct. To abstain from lying. And to abstain from intoxicants like drugs or alcohol that cloud the mind. It doesn't mean you don't take your meds that are maybe useful for your mental health, but you abstain from intoxicants that may cloud the mind. And so the Buddha referred to these 5 in different ways, giving us different perspectives of understanding them. So sometimes he called them the 5 training rules, and sometimes the 5 virtues, and sometimes the 5 truths. There's even the expression of the 5 things, which could seem odd, but in a way it helps free us from a fixed idea about what these things are and how they function. So there are 3 ways of understanding these 5 things. The first is as rules of behavior. They're not considered commandments, but the Buddha called them training rules. We voluntarily take on the training. Precepts as a discipline for support of our spiritual training. And following them promotes the development of meditation and wisdom and compassion. So as training rules, these 5 things are understood as rules of restraint. They're phrased as, for the sake of my training, I vow not to kill or not to steal, and so forth. So we agree to hold back on certain impulses instead of following our inclination to kill a mosquito or steal pencils from work, or we hold back and try to bring mindfulness to the discomfort that we are impulsively reacting to, rather than focusing on whether the actions are bad or immoral. We use these restraints as mirrors to study ourselves, to understand our reactions and motivations, and to reflect on the consequences of our actions. I have to share with you about the time that I was shopping at Fred Meyer's, like just a week ago or so. And I was at this self-checkout section, and some fruit that I was buying only got rung up as 1 apple instead of 3. And I put them all in the sack and I kept going. And you know how the computer voice says, an assistant will be with you shortly, or something like that, where, it's the voice that says somebody has to come help me. And when I scanned the next item, it just went on, and I kept scanning. And so I really, I continued scanning to the end, since no attendant came over. It just kept on going all right. And I finally convinced myself to follow the precepts and not take what wasn't given to me, and to pull out those other 2 apples and scan them. And so many thoughts went racing through my mind as I sort of battled with Mara, so to speak. It's like the freedom of relinquishment, of letting go of that clinging that I was doing, and all of the stuff that went on in my mind about, well, nobody saw me, and it's only a couple of apples, but by living with the precepts, and this freedom that came with it gives a result of what they say in the suttas called blamelessness. That the convoluted mind patterns that were going through me as I continued scanning and, wondering, well, should I get away with this or not? It's like, it's so interesting that the living by the precepts, you don't think very long about that sort of thing. I mean, that whole process took me maybe, 3 minutes to say, okay, I would rather be blameless, and I would rather have freedom in my mind than the long-term constriction that would happen, knowing, in this petty little minor moment that I had taken something that wasn't given to me. But the freedom and joy that happens in the mind when we let go, when we renounce something that's going to cause ourselves or others harm, there's a great joy in that. And following these training rules offers us this powerful form of protection. Primarily the precepts protect us from ourselves, from the suffering that we cause ourselves and others when we act unskillfully. So that's that first way that it's looked at as these training rules and of the ethics. And the second way that the Buddha talked about the precepts was as principles of virtue. The fundamental principles that underlie all 5 of the precepts are compassion, not causing harm, and generosity. So we follow the precepts out of compassion, out of a sense of the suffering of others, and out of possibility that others can be free from suffering. We also live by the precepts out of compassion for ourselves. We want to be careful about our intentional actions, how we act, how we speak, even the kinds of thoughts we pursue. That was happening with me in that whole Fred Meyer's incident, so that the precepts don't become a rigid ideal that we live by. We practice them together with the principle of non-harming. We can keep in check any tendency to create harm by asking ourselves, Is this action causing harm to myself or others? The understanding of what causes harm brings humanity to these precepts. Taking that time at the store to see the kind of thoughts that I was pursuing and got involved in was quite taxing, really. And I saw the way that I was harming myself with all of that. And living by the precepts is itself an act of generosity. We give a wonderful gift of protection to ourselves and to others. One reason to follow the precepts as guides of restraint is to bring joy to ourselves, joy to our lives. And some people meditate because they feel they are lacking in joy and happiness. And according to the Buddha, one of the best ways to cultivate and appreciate joy is to live an ethical, virtuous life. So the third way that the Buddha talked about the precepts was as qualities of a person's character. The Buddha described someone who was spiritually well developed as endowed with the 5 virtues. He said that once you reach a certain level of awakening, it's simply not possible to break the precepts. Following the precepts is a direct byproduct of having discovered freedom. So to sum this up, these 5 things can be understood as rules of training or principles to guide our actions, as a description of how an awakened person acts. So I think you'd probably agree that the world needs more people with the intention, sensitivity, and purity of heart represented by the 5 precepts. Those 3 ways that the Buddha talked about: rules of behavior, principles of virtue, and the qualities of a person's character. And so may these precepts be a source of joy to ourselves and for everyone. Thank you for listening to the Dhamma, and may the goodness of our practice together really be of benefit to ourselves and others, to all sentient beings. With that, my official Dhamma talk is over.